In the luxurious Whitford mansion, anticipation filled the air. The classical walls, adorned with fine fabrics and gold accents, echoed the sophistication of a family known for power and wealth for generations. Every detail of the decor had been meticulously planned to convey a message. This wasn't just a wedding, but the union of two lives that, at first glance, couldn't be more different. Emily Carter, the bride, looked like a vision out of a dream. Her custom-designed dress combined delicate lace and imported silk, draping her slender figure with regal elegance. Her hair was pinned up in a graceful chignon with subtle pearl earrings that had belonged to James's mother. Standing at the end of the aisle, Emily gazed at the man she believed was the love of her life, filled with a pure happiness she had never known. She took a deep breath to hold back the joyful tears, and with each step the memories of her humble, solitary past felt even further away. Right there, in that moment, she felt it had all been worth it. This was her chance to be happy, to build the family she had never had. Before we dive further into this emotional story, I'd like to ask you for something special. Please subscribe to the channel and help me reach the long-awaited milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Every one of you makes a huge difference, and having your support means the world to me. James Whitford, the groom, was the epitome of a successful and desirable man. In his impeccable tuxedo, he radiated a presence of power befitting the heir to one of the most respected families in the US. He stood seriously, his eyes fixed on the bride, yet something dark lurked in his gaze. He tried to ignore the inner voices, the whispers of doubt that had haunted him all week. After all, what more could he want? He was about to marry a sweet, devoted woman who, unlike the women in his social circle, didn't seem obsessed with his money and status. Emily looked at him with genuine admiration, a feeling no other woman had ever shown him in that way. Hundreds of guests watched every detail in reverent silence, as if witnessing a grand spectacle. Among them were prominent figures of society, well-known business leaders, politicians, and celebrities, all captivated by the union of James and Emily. For many, this marriage represented proof that the Whitfords would maintain their solid and respected image. But for some keen observers, a subtle tension surrounded James, a hesitation that was starting to become visible. Then came the critical moment. The pastor, with his deep voice, invited James to seal his commitment. He extended his hand for James to take the ring and place it on Emily's finger, symbolizing the eternal love he had vowed to her. Emily smiled, her heart racing with joy and anticipation. She didn't know it would be the last innocent smile she'd give that day. James locked eyes with Emily for a long moment, as if trying to read the depths of her feelings. His gaze seemed to search for something he couldn't quite identify. Was it fear, uncertainty, or something even deeper? The doubts he had tried to bury throughout the wedding preparations returned with an uncontrollable force, like furious waves tearing down a sandcastle. He hesitated, his hand frozen over the ring glinting in his pocket. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Marrying someone of modest origins is a risk, James. Think about what this could do to our family's image." The weight of social pressure, the fear of disappointing those he had always respected, pressed heavily on his shoulders. James looked away, feeling a wave of despair swell in his chest. Emily, with her pure, hopeful eyes, seemed oblivious to the storm raging inside her groom. Then, in a gesture no one could have anticipated, James took a step back, a single step that sounded like thunder in the crowded room. Emily's smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of confusion and dread. She stared at him, unbelieving, unable to grasp what was happening. "James?" she whispered, her voice trembling, almost pleading, but he didn't answer. Instead, with a vacant look and an impassive face, James slowly turned and started walking toward the exit. Each step seemed to echo like a hammer in Emily's soul as she began to grasp the weight of what was happening. Her world started spinning, as if reality were unraveling. The guests, initially stunned, began to murmur. Whispers and disapproving glances filled the hall. "Is he leaving her at the altar?" someone whispered. Emily felt her legs give way. Her body was in shock, unable to react, as her eyes filled with tears. Each second stretched into eternity as she watched James, the man she believed to be her true love, walk away without looking back, shattering her dreams without a single word of explanation. She felt her heart break into thousands of pieces, like shattered glass scattered across a cold, unforgiving floor. The pastor tried to intervene, calling James's name, but he was already determined to leave. James's mother, Margaret, watched in horror and disapproval. The family patriarch, the stern and imposing Mr. Whitford, simply shook his head as if confirming something he had always suspected. Emily was now alone, under the gaze of hundreds of people who just moments before had celebrated the love she thought she had found. She could hear a few stifled laughs, murmurs of mockery and speculation. Every whispered word was a stab at her dignity, every pitying look a cruel reminder of the humiliating fate that had just been imposed on her. Finally, with the last bit of strength she had left, Emily lifted her head. With her face streaked with tears, she turned to the guests and, in one final act of defiance, walked out of the hall, determined never to look back. Outside, the sun shone mercilessly, contrasting with the storm raging in her heart. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She was completely alone, as she had always been, and everything she thought she had achieved disappeared like a sandcastle washed away by the waves. After the disastrous wedding, Emily disappeared as suddenly as her groom had abandoned her. In a city where the Whitford name meant power and wealth, the scandal spread like wildfire. In the first few days, Emily was the target of every rumor. Journalists, eager for a piece of the story, camped around the Whitford mansion and staked out her modest apartment, hoping for an interview, a statement, or even a single heartbreaking photo of the abandoned bride. But Emily didn't budge. Instead, she sank into a silence so profound, it seemed as if she never wanted to emerge. The small apartment she rented felt like a prison. The narrow windows let in little light, and the cold, faded beige walls seemed to reflect Emily's melancholy. Every corner of that cramped space was filled with an overwhelming loneliness. She spent hours sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, her mind spinning, unable to find answers for James's cruel abandonment. With every beat of her heart, another wave of pain spread through her chest like a relentless dagger. Silent tears streamed down her face as she relived that fateful day, remembering every detail. James's hesitant look, his step back, the shock that paralyzed her as she realized he was leaving without a word. Each flash of memory made Emily feel more helpless and vulnerable. It wasn't just the pain of loss. It was the public humiliation, the shame of having so blindly believed in the love of a man who ultimately saw her as nothing more than a burden. The days dragged on in a cruel monotony. Emily drowned in a sea of rumpled sheets, unable to get out of bed or face the outside world. Her phone rang incessantly, but she ignored every call. Concerned friends left supportive messages, trying to understand what had happened, but she didn't respond. She couldn't bear the thought of talking about it. Silence seemed to be her only way to protect what remained of her dignity. The press, however, was relentless. Every day, a new speculation emerged in the tabloids. Rumors claimed that Emily had done something unforgivable, that she had deceived James in some way, or even that her past was filled with dark secrets. Some journalists even insinuated that she was a gold digger, someone who had taken advantage of James's love for social advancement. Emily saw all this, but she didn't react. Each word written about her was another blow, but she refused to fuel the spectacle everyone wanted to see. Amid so much suffering, she began to feel something strange inside herself, a mix of hatred and disdain that grew each day. The love she had felt for James was slowly turning into a deep scar, a bitter reminder of how naive she had been. She felt angry at herself for believing that someone like him could truly love her, for letting her guard down and getting lost in a fantasy that, in the end, only served to tear her soul apart. Looking at herself in the bathroom mirror, she often struggled to recognize the person staring back. Her face, once radiant and full of life, was now pale and lifeless. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of dreams, were shadowed by deep, dark circles, reminders of a past that haunted her. Every trace of happiness had been replaced by a sadness that seemed impossible to heal. She barely ate and only left the house to buy the bare essentials to survive. In the apartment, everything seemed to represent mourning. Emily's clothes were strewn across the floor, dishes and utensils piled up in the sink. She had no energy to keep the place tidy, not even to make her bed. It was as if the chaos around her reflected the torment her life had become. Every morning, as she opened her eyes, a part of her wished that it had all been a nightmare from which she could finally wake up. But harsh reality confronted her with a brutality that only seemed to intensify with each passing day. Although she avoided contact with people, Emily knew she had to support herself, and with the little she had, she paid the rent for her small apartment. The funds she had saved over years of modest work were now her only safety net. The amount she had managed to gather was modest, and as she watched her bank balance dwindle daily, a wave of anxiety washed over her. There was no longer the comfort of a stable future she had imagined with James. All that remained was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The city continued its bustling life outside, but Emily had become a shadow, a silent and invisible figure, passing unnoticed among the crowds. Occasionally, she would see a happy couple walking hand in hand or hear distant laughter, bringing a pang of pain she didn't know how to silence. The happiness of others had become a painful reminder of all she had lost, of everything that could have been, but now seemed a distant illusion. Weeks passed, but for Emily, each day was merely a continuation of the last, a repetition of a suffering that seemed endless. She no longer knew what it meant to feel joy. All that remained was a crushing emptiness and the certainty that she would never trust anyone again. She had learned the hard way that fairy tales didn't exist and that trusting someone could be an act of destruction. Over time, her friends stopped calling. They began to understand that Emily wasn't ready to talk, perhaps not even ready to face what had happened. For the few who still tried, their messages shifted in tone, from questions about what happened to distant words of support, wishing she would find peace. On nights when the silence became unbearable, Emily would take walks through the city streets, hidden under a coat that covered her face. She wandered aimlessly, almost like a lost soul, feeling like an intruder in her own world. She passed by places where James used to take her, and in those moments, she had to hold back tears to avoid breaking down in the street. She couldn't bear the looks of pity, didn't want to be seen as the abandoned bride that everyone now knew her as. She had lost her identity, her dignity, and in some way her will to live. Her dreams, her hopes, all the plans she had made for the future had been destroyed by the merciless abandonment of the man who had promised to love her. Each night, when sleep finally came, it was a momentary relief, a brief escape from the torment she called life. But upon waking, the pain always returned, relentless as a storm that never ceased. Emily had become a prisoner of her own suffering, living in self-imposed exile while the city and its people moved on, oblivious to the depths of the pain she carried. It was a silent suffering, but overwhelming, consuming her little by little, leaving her a shadow of who she once was. Meanwhile, regret began to creep into James Whitford's life like a shadow he couldn't ignore. Initially, he tried to dismiss the emptiness that haunted him, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. His family expected him to be resolute, to uphold the Whitford name and reputation. The decision to abandon Emily had been difficult, but he told himself she wasn't the right one. However, the conviction he expressed didn't hold the same weight when he found himself alone, without his family's scrutinizing eyes or the polite approval of his friends. In those quiet moments, the regret began to grow slowly, like a poison seeping into his veins. The first few weeks were confusing. James tried to bury himself in work, social engagements, anything that could occupy his mind and block out thoughts of Emily. He attended gala dinners, corporate events, and endless meetings, surrounded by people who sought his approval, sycophants who laughed at his jokes without actually listening. But deep down, he knew it was all a hollow facade, and even when distractions worked for a few hours, the image of Emily alone, devastated and with tears in her eyes, would reappear in his mind, relentless, like a ghost that refused to let him be. At night, when he returned to the Whitford mansion, the silence of the place suffocated him. The hallways, once so familiar, now seemed cold and empty, as if echoing the abandonment he had inflicted on Emily. He found himself imagining what life would have been like with her, the warmth of her presence turning those opulent rooms into something that could be called home. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, seemed a cruel reminder that he had chosen coldness and status over true emotion. One night, James decided to go to bed early, exhausted from the routine and the frantic schedule he kept to avoid thoughts of Emily. But sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned, feeling the weight of his choices crushing him. Staring at the ceiling, he remembered every detail of Emily's face that last day, the way she smiled at him as she walked down the aisle, the hope in her eyes that turned to terror, and finally, to utter despair. James closed his eyes, trying to push the memory away, but the image was etched in his mind like a wound that refused to heal. He began to realize with painful clarity that remorse would not easily fade. The memories of Emily, the shy smile, the gentle gestures, her genuine laughter, rose to the surface with relentless force. And in that crushing pain, James started to understand that by leaving Emily, he hadn't just abandoned a person, He had walked away from a genuine happiness he had never found with anyone else. Time passed, but the emptiness only deepened. James tried to convince himself that it was temporary, that he would soon get over it, and that Emily would move on, perhaps finding someone more suited to her. But the lie he told himself began to crumble when he found himself searching for news about her. Secretly, James read tabloids and gossip magazines he had always despised, looking for any mention of Emily. He knew that the wedding scandal had taken on enormous proportions, but there were no longer any mentions of her. It was as if Emily had vanished from the face of the earth. That absence, that deafening silence, disturbed him more than he could have imagined. James was tormented by the feeling that he had destroyed something precious. During social gatherings, he masked his discomfort with smiles and trivial conversations. He worked hard to appear carefree, but the looks from friends and acquaintances, especially those who had been at the wedding, carried a subtle judgment. Some looked at him with pity, as if they knew somehow that he had lost far more than he had gained by making that choice. One day, during a business meeting, James completely lost focus when he heard Emily's name casually mentioned by an executive. He froze, his heart racing, waiting for what he would say next. The man casually remarked that he had never understood James's choice to get involved with someone so simple, implying that it was inevitable that the relationship would end. The comment, one he might have made himself weeks earlier, now sounded like a cutting insult. Something inside him rebelled. Without understanding why, James abruptly stood up and left the meeting, leaving the executive and others baffled. These small moments of regret turned into a continuous torment. He began to have difficulty looking at himself in the mirror, and his nights of sleep grew shorter. The face he saw reflected looked tired, worn. The eyes, once so confident and proud, now carried a shadow of sadness and regret he couldn't hide. Even his mother, Margaret, a strict and disciplined woman, noticed the change. She confronted him one night, trying to understand what was happening. "James, what's wrong with you? You seem like a stranger in this house," she said, her voice a mix of concern and impatience. He tried to dodge the question, but she pressed on, suggesting that it might be the result of the choice he had made. "Sometimes we need more than appearances and status, James. Don't you think you might have made a mistake?" He responded with a vacant look and a cold nod, but inside, he felt the weight of every word. His pride, which had so often helped him earn society's respect, now felt like a prison of suffering. As days turned into weeks, remorse became a constant presence. James realized he couldn't undo the past, that what he had done to Emily was irreversible. He had left her alone at the most vulnerable moment of her life, and now, even if he tried, he didn't know if he could find forgiveness. At night, as silence surrounded him, he wondered how Emily might be. He knew she had suffered, and the thought that he was the cause of that suffering ate away at him. What tortured him most was the certainty that Emily, in her silent pain, would never seek revenge. She was too kind for that. She had always seemed to forgive easily, to look for the good in people, and perhaps ironically that made the remorse even more unbearable. If she hated him, if she showed the bitterness he knew he deserved, maybe it would be easier to live with the guilt. But Emily's silence was his true punishment, a silent scream echoing in his mind day and night, reminding him that he had failed as a man and as a lover. Over time, James's regret was no longer a shadow he could ignore. It was a constant presence, an inner voice that tormented him, reminding him with every step of what he had let go and the happiness he had destroyed. The evening was in full swing, and the business dinner was overflowing with luxury and discreet conversations. James Whitford sat around a table with men he considered his equals, major businessmen and elite figures who treated him with the respect reserved for the truly powerful. He took small sips of wine, trying to maintain his usual composed demeanor, but the truth was James was exhausted. The persistent pain of regret for abandoning Emily had become a shadow that followed him everywhere. Even at an event filled with distractions, he felt constantly haunted by memories of her. In the midst of a random conversation about investments, one of the men casually mentioned Emily's name. James tensed, as if an alarm had gone off in his mind. He tried to hide his immediate interest, but he couldn't help but hang on to every word. The comment was brief, something about how he, James, had dodged a woman with a mysterious background. Another man at the table, with a cynical smile, added a remark about the unusual life Emily seemed to have led before meeting James. Intrigued and simultaneously uncomfortable, James couldn't resist, and asked, in a casual tone, what they knew about Emily. The men exchanged looks and smiles, as if sharing a secret he wasn't privy to. One of them, the boldest, said that Emily was different, and that according to a close source, she belonged to a lineage shrouded in mystery and misfortune. Those words echoed in James's mind, leaving him restless. He struggled to maintain a controlled expression, but inside, his heart was racing. A mysterious lineage. He had never known much about Emily's past, but he had thought her life was simple, that she came from a humble family with no great stories. However, the comment sparked an uncontrollable curiosity. Something about the tone in which those men spoke suggested there was much more to Emily than he had ever imagined. When the dinner ended, James returned home, troubled. He couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He felt driven to uncover the truth, as if it were a necessity. But at the same time, a new anxiety was emerging, as if deep down he knew something dark awaited him. After all, he had left her without hesitation, without even questioning who she truly was, and now knowing about her life was becoming an obsession. The next day, James discreetly began his investigation. First, he tried to find information online, searching public records about Emily's family, but the results were scant. There was almost no documented information about her childhood, only records of adoption and orphanages. This lack of information only heightened the sense of mystery. Was Emily an ordinary person like any other, or did she carry secrets so deep he couldn't comprehend? Intrigued, he hired a private investigator, someone trustworthy who was known for his discretion in investigations. He gave him the few details he had: her name, age, places she had lived. He said he wanted to know everything about Emily Carter, every detail that could be uncovered. The investigator, accustomed to clients wanting to dig into others' pasts, didn't ask many questions and accepted the job, promising to bring him answers in a few days. The following days were agonizing for James. Every time the phone rang, his heart raced, but it was never the investigator. He began waking up several times during the night, as if he were waiting for some revelation that would finally fill the void he felt. In his brief hours of sleep, dreams tormented him. He saw Emily in strange places, surrounded by shadows and unknown figures he couldn't make out. She called to him, but whenever he tried to approach, something stopped him. These dreams left him increasingly tense, as if the truth were trying to emerge from some dark place in his mind. Finally, after almost a week of unbearable waiting, the investigator called him for a meeting. James was nervous, anxious to hear what had been discovered, but also afraid of what lay ahead. When he entered the discreet office where the meeting was scheduled, the investigator offered him a thick file full of documents and photos. James took the envelope with trembling hands, dreading what he was about to discover. The first pages revealed details he had never imagined. Emily had been born into a family with a history full of misfortune. Her mother, a woman named Clara Harrington, had been the heiress of one of the city's most traditional and controversial families. The Harringtons were known for both their fortune and their family tragedies. In the decade before Emily's birth, the Harrington family had been devastated by financial and personal scandals. Clara, in particular, had been marked by a series of unfortunate events: a missing brother, a father who died under mysterious circumstances, and a marriage that ended tragically. According to the records, Clara disappeared from high society shortly after Emily was born, leaving her daughter to be raised in an orphanage. The girl had never been officially registered as part of the Harrington family. It was as if they had done everything to hide her existence, as if Emily were a secret that shouldn't be revealed. James felt suffocated imagining how much Emily must have suffered, growing up without a family and without answers about her own past. But the most disturbing revelation was still to come. On one of the last pages of the report, there was information that left James stunned. Before disappearing completely, Clara Harrington had left a series of letters for her daughter, letters Emily had never received. In these letters, Clara mentioned that the Harrington family was cursed, that all descendants were haunted by loss and tragedy, and that she feared for her daughter's future. James read with wide eyes and a chill down his spine. Emily, from birth, had been condemned to a life of loneliness and pain. As he read, he felt devastated. All the lies and omissions, all the secrets Emily's family had hidden, revealed the depth of the suffering she carried in silence. She had always seemed delicate to him, but he had never imagined the weight of her past. How could he have been so blind? He remembered the way she avoided talking about family, how she would change the subject when he pressed her. At the time, James thought it was just shyness, perhaps a trait of her humility. But now he understood. Emily didn't hide her past out of shame, but as a way to protect herself, like someone trying to shield an open wound. At the end of his reading, James felt ashamed. He had judged Emily so harshly, assumed she was a simple woman, unworthy of his position. And now he saw that she was far stronger and more resilient than anyone he knew. She bore not only the weight of a difficult life, but also the dark legacy she had chosen not to share with anyone, not even with him, her would-be husband. The weight of this truth was a blow to James. His remorse consumed him. He had abandoned Emily at the altar, dismissing a woman who had fought all her life against demons he could never have imagined, and instead of being her refuge, he had humiliated her in front of everyone. The overwhelming guilt settled in. He now realized that he might never be worthy of the love of someone like her, a woman who, even with every reason to hate the world, had still managed to love him purely and unconditionally. James was left facing a truth he could never have imagined. Emily Carter, the woman he had abandoned at the altar, was the daughter of Thomas Harrington, one of New York's most powerful and enigmatic men. Thomas Harrington, the same man who had built an empire and wielded his power and influence over everything, from giant corporations to politicians and the elite of society. This revelation hit him like a crushing blow, stirring a mix of disbelief, anguish, and a fear he couldn't yet name. As he read through the detailed documents the investigator had given him, James felt his heart sink. How could he not have seen it? Everything was clearly recorded. Emily, the product of a brief and tragic relationship between her mother, Clara Harrington, and Thomas, had never been acknowledged by her father. Despite her Harrington blood, Emily had been relegated to a dark fate, far from any privilege, as if her very existence were a stain on the family name. It was clear that Thomas had never wanted his daughter involved in his life. For him, Emily was a forbidden secret, a truth he had buried along with the past. But what intrigued James most was the fact that Emily had never claimed anything. She had never sought fortune, inheritance, or the recognition she could have demanded. Instead, she chose to live a simple, quiet life far from any luxury or ostentation. The world could have been hers, but she preferred to distance herself from it all, giving up the wealth of an empire to protect her own dignity. The weight of her choice was something James could not fully understand, but his respect for Emily only grew. Unlike him, who lived bound by expectations and family reputation, she had been able to give up everything to preserve herself. However, the truth brought with it a shadow. An uneasiness began to grow within James. If Emily had kept something so deep and powerful a secret, what else could she be hiding? He couldn't help but wonder. Was Emily as transparent as he had thought? Could she be hiding other secrets, perhaps even darker, to protect herself from the relentless clutches of the Harringtons? Doubt planted a seed in his heart, but his consuming remorse was even greater. After all, he had abandoned an extraordinary woman, someone with more strength and courage than he had ever had. James couldn't get these thoughts out of his head. He tried to contact her, but his calls went unanswered. He even wrote a letter apologizing and confessing that he wanted to understand who she really was. But Emily did not reply. Days went by without a word. She remained as silent and distant as the secret she kept, and that only increased James's torment. He was about to try to see her in person when he received unexpected news. Emily had disappeared. Emily's disappearance came as a shock. She simply vanished without a trace. He tried contacting mutual friends, but no one knew where she was. Not even her closest acquaintances had any news of her. When he sought more information, he discovered that she had sold all her belongings, terminated the lease on the small apartment where she had been living, and disappeared from New York. The news hit James like a catastrophe. It was as if life were punishing him for his choices, pulling Emily further away from him, making any chance of redemption impossible. Desperate, James did everything possible to find any clue that might lead him to her. He hired the private investigator once more, this time with an almost impossible mission: to locate Emily, no matter where she was. James was willing to spend whatever it took, sacrifice whatever was necessary, but with each passing day, the sense of emptiness only grew. As weeks turned into months, he began to understand what he had truly lost. It wasn't just the woman he loved, but the sense of meaning she had brought into his life. He now realized, with painful clarity, that beside Emily, he had felt something he had never known: peace and authenticity. She accepted him for who he was, without the layers of pride and status that society imposed, but he had thrown it all away out of insecurity and arrogance. All efforts to locate her proved fruitless. Emily had done an excellent job of erasing herself from the world. James began to see this as a conscious choice on her part, a final, wordless goodbye, a gesture that made it clear she wanted to rebuild her life, far from any trace of their relationship. He remembered her look the last time they had seen each other, a look full of pain and disappointment that haunted him every night. In a desperate gesture, he began visiting the places they had been together, hoping for some answer, something that might lead him to her. James wandered the streets they used to walk hand in hand, entered the cafes and restaurants they frequented, sometimes staying for hours in a place just to relive the memories they had shared. The city now seemed like a museum of lost memories. Every corner, every building, everything held the ghost of Emily and the life he had wasted. At one point, he found himself walking to the orphanage where Emily had spent part of her childhood. Standing in front of the worn-down building, James felt a deep wave of pain. In that bleak place, Emily had grown up, facing a loneliness he had never known. And yet, she had been able to love and trust him, someone who, in the end, only caused her more suffering. Realizing this, he began to cry, tears sliding silently down his face, a mix of remorse and an unending sorrow. For months, James lived in this state of torment and desolation, completely consumed by guilt and loneliness. He stopped attending social events, set aside professional commitments, and even the business meetings that had always kept him busy. His family began to worry, especially his mother, who, seeing James's state, tried to talk to him, but he refused to speak, to confront what he felt. Nothing she said could ease the suffering he had brought upon himself. In that same luxurious mansion, where he had once taken pride in his accomplishments and his family's prestige, James now wandered the hallways like a ghost. Every step he took, every room he passed through, seemed a reminder of the irrevocable loss he had brought upon himself. Even the bed that had once been a symbol of comfort was now a place of insomnia and agony. He avoided looking in the mirror because he couldn't bear to see the reflection of a man who had done so much harm to the woman he claimed to love. As the months passed, hopelessness became his constant companion. James realized that he might never see Emily again, that he had lost her forever due to his own arrogance and weakness. The words he never spoke, the apologies he never offered, all haunted him like a crushing weight on his heart. He finally understood that what hurt the most was not Emily's absence, but the emptiness he had created in his life by giving up the only true love he had ever known. The quest for answers began to consume James Whitford like a desperate need. Days passed in a fog of anguish and despair as he tried to piece together the puzzle of Emily's life. He needed to know what he had lost. Every discovery brought him closer to a painful truth he couldn't ignore, a burden he carried with him at every step. It was as if by learning about her past, he could somehow atone for his sins, understand the suffering he had inflicted on her. He started at the orphanage where Emily had spent most of her childhood, a sad and worn building in the city's outskirts, far from the glitter and opulence he had always known. Walking through those cold corridors, he felt the weight of every step, as if the walls held the dark secrets of the life Emily had tried to leave behind. James found an older woman who had worked there when Emily was a child. With a weary look and deep wrinkles that spoke of a life of work and disappointments, she regarded him with some suspicion, but eventually agreed to tell him what she knew. The woman's words were harsh and sad. She described Emily as a sweet and timid girl, a child who always tried to help others despite everything she faced. James was horrified to learn that Emily had endured episodes of neglect and abuse there. She had been left at the mercy of a system that seemed designed to crush any shred of hope. The orphanage, according to the woman, was known for its lack of resources, and the children were often victims of mistreatment. James felt nauseated imagining Emily's vulnerability in such a place. As the woman recounted her memories of Emily, James listened in silence, feeling the weight of each word as if it were a direct accusation. He had never imagined that someone could survive such a cruel childhood and still maintain the kindness and generosity he had seen in Emily. She had emerged from an environment he himself would never have endured, yet he had humiliated her and left her alone at the very moment she believed in the possibility of happiness. The remorse that tormented him intensified, mingling with a bitter admiration for the strength of a woman who, despite everything, had never let herself be corrupted. Leaving the orphanage, James knew he couldn't stop. He sought out others who knew Emily, co-workers, distant friends, anyone who could give him more pieces of her life. And with each new story he heard, the image he had of Emily became more solid, more painful to bear. She was the opposite of everything he represented. While he had grown up in a mansion surrounded by luxury and privilege, she had fought to stand on her own, to build a dignified life with the little help fate had granted her. The brutal reality of the differences between them was overwhelming, and James began to realize that her suffering could never be undone. But he wasn't willing to give up. He needed to see her again. He needed, at least, to try to explain to her what he now understood, even if it was too late. Months of searching eventually led him to a small coastal town, a place forgotten by most, with cobbled streets and a salty breeze that seemed to carry old, bitter stories. There, James found her. Emily, living under a false name, was leading a simple life, working in a small cafe that looked like something out of a picturesque setting. He saw her by chance while wandering the street, lost in thought. When his eyes met hers, he almost doubted what he was seeing. Emily was behind the counter, her movements calm and methodical as she served a customer a cup of coffee. She looked different, thinner, her features more defined by the hardness of a life that he now knew had been one of constant struggle and resilience. He stopped, unsure how to react. It was her, but at the same time, she was not the same woman he had left at the altar. She was someone who had learned to rebuild herself, to move on despite everything. When Emily saw him, her face hardened, and a look of pure disdain took over her eyes. James felt a chill run down his spine. He approached, trying to speak, but the words refused to come out. He stammered an apology, trying to explain how much he regretted what he had done, but Emily didn't want to hear it. In a firm tone, she told him to leave, to let her live the life she had built without him. Her eyes, once so gentle, were now cold and full of bitterness. She was no longer the dreamer he had known, but someone who had learned to live with the weight of the pain he had caused her. He begged for a chance to explain, but she simply laughed, a bitter laugh that seemed to echo with the sound of waves breaking in the distance. "You destroyed me, James," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed pain. "Because of you, I lost more than you can imagine." She revealed that in addition to losing his love, the scandal of the wedding had cost her an important promotion at work. It was an opportunity she had fought for years to earn, and it all vanished when he left her at the altar, exposing her to public ridicule and humiliation. James tried to argue, but she continued, relentless. She told him how she had been forced to leave New York, how everyone looked at her with contempt and pity, how she had lost not only her job, but also the dignity she had fought so hard to preserve. "I built my life alone, without anyone's help. But you took everything from me in an instant," she said, her gaze making him feel smaller by the second. "Do you think I can simply forgive you and forget?" Emily's words cut through James like knives. He realized that his regret meant nothing in the face of the devastation he had caused. His attempt at redemption now seemed ridiculous. He felt the weight of his choices, the selfishness and cowardice that led him to humiliate her without even giving her a chance to defend herself. She was right to hate him. He knew that if he were in her place, he would never forgive. In a final act of desperation, he tried to reach for her hand, but Emily stepped back, looking at him with a contempt he had never imagined he would see in her eyes. "Please, leave, James," she whispered, her voice choked. "I want to forget that you were ever part of my life." Without another word, she turned and walked back to the cafe with firm steps. James stood there alone, feeling more empty and broken than ever. It was as if all that remained of his life were a handful of ruins scattered in the wind. He stood there for a long time, tasting the bitter defeat and loss. Emily had moved on, and he finally understood that nothing he could do now would change the past. She had learned to live without him, to overcome the pain he had caused, while he was left to face the consequences of his own actions, like an endless sentence. The night was calm, but the atmosphere was thick with unresolved emotions. After the brutal encounter at the cafe, James couldn't get Emily out of his thoughts. The fleeting, painful meeting had left deep scars, but he couldn't accept that it was the end. There was something he needed to say, words he had held back for years, feelings he had never had the courage to express, and he knew that without confronting these truths, he would never be able to move on. It was as if he had been waiting his whole life to understand who he really was, and Emily, even from afar, held the key to that discovery. After many attempts and rejections, Emily finally agreed to meet him, perhaps to close that chapter of her life that had cost her so much. They met on a deserted beach, far from prying eyes and the wounds New York had inflicted on them. The sea whispered in the background, with waves gently breaking as the night enveloped them in darkness. James stood facing the horizon with a heavy expression, as if about to shoulder the hardest burden of his life. When he saw Emily approaching, he felt a tightness in his chest, a silent pain mingling with the guilt and love that were now impossible to hide. Emily watched him from a distance, hesitating for a moment. Her eyes reflected the deep hurt he had caused her. She no longer loved him. Of that, she was certain. But she needed to hear what he had to say, perhaps as a way of finding closure for all the pain that had accompanied her since that fateful wedding day. She approached in silence, keeping a certain distance, as if she needed that invisible barrier to protect herself from yet another wound. James, with a hesitant voice and his gaze on the ground, began to speak. He confessed his feelings like he had never done before. He told her about his suffocating fear of losing his independence, of being consumed by his family's expectations, and of becoming a reflection of the ambitions his parents had always projected onto him. "I always feared marriage, Emily," he said, his voice shaking. "To me, it felt like a prison, a gilded cage from which I could never escape." He paused, catching his breath as if each word were a struggle. "I was afraid of losing my identity, of living in the shadow of what my family expected of me. And when I was there, about to take that step with you, the fear overcame me." Emily listened in silence, but her eyes reflected a mix of pain and indignation. James noticed but continued, feeling he needed to confess everything. He told her that despite his fears, he loved her. It was a love he could only understand now, when everything seemed lost. But he knew he had failed as a man and as a lover, and now each word sounded like a sentence, a cruel judgment he imposed on himself. Unable to contain the anger boiling in her chest, Emily finally interrupted him. Her voice was firm, but it trembled with emotion. "A prison?" she asked with a sarcastic tone. "You speak as if I were the one who wanted to imprison you. But the truth is, I never expected anything but love, James. Nothing but honesty." She took a step forward, staring him down, her gaze burning with resentment. "I've lived in shadows my whole life. I never had anyone to support me. I never had the luxury of feeling safe. But you pushed me into the abyss, without even giving me a chance." James fell silent, paralyzed by the weight of Emily's words. He wanted to respond, to justify, to say he was sorry, but she continued, her voice heavy with years of pent-up pain. "I came to you with everything I had, James," she said, her words breaking at the end. "I gave you my heart, my dreams, the little that I had. You were the only person I trusted, and you trampled on it without even looking back." James tried to hold her hand, but she recoiled as if his touch were poisonous. "Now you say you love me?" she continued, her voice icy. "Now that I don't need you anymore? Now that I've learned to live without you despite everything you did to me?" Her face was streaked with silent tears, but her eyes remained hard. "I built my own world. I survived the hell you left behind, and now you come here to ask for forgiveness?" He felt each of her words like a dagger. He wanted to shout, to beg for a chance to redeem himself, but he knew it was too late. I just wanted you to know that I understand how much I hurt you, Emily," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken, "and that if I could, I would go back in time to do it all differently." Emily laughed bitterly. "Do it differently?" She shook her head in disbelief. "You don't know what it means to live in constant survival mode, James. For you, suffering was a choice. You chose to abandon me. You chose to expose me and ruin my life. But for me, there was no choice. I had to start from scratch, finding strength I didn't even know I had." James knew he had nothing left to say. The magnitude of his mistake had never been clearer than now. He looked at her one last time, seeing how Emily's face, marked by pain and resilience, reflected the truth he had tried to ignore. He had lost her love forever, and there was no hope of regaining what he had once had. Emily studied him for a few seconds, as if trying to find the last remnant of the man she had once loved. But her gaze grew cold and distant, as if the ghost of the past had finally faded away. "Goodbye, James," she said, in a firm and definitive tone. "I hope you learn one day what it means to love without destroying." She turned and began to walk back to the city without looking back. James watched her disappear into the darkness, his heart clenched with unending regret, knowing he had lost her forever. The weight of wrong choices, the fears that had ruled him, and the pain he had inflicted on her crushed him. He knew that her words would haunt him for the rest of his life, like a relentless echo reminding him of the chance he had destroyed. After that painful confrontation on the beach, James felt he had lost Emily forever. Her words echoed in his mind like a final sentence, a verdict that he was unworthy of forgiveness. He returned to New York, but something inside him had changed forever. There was no more joy in his return to the city's luxuries and comforts. Everything felt empty, cold, and meaningless. The days dragged on in a monotony he had never known, a life filled with everything money could buy, but completely devoid of purpose. In a final effort at redemption, he sought out Emily one last time, unsure of what he expected to hear from her. She met him with a hard, determined expression, like someone who had nothing left to lose. There was no longer any sweetness in her gaze. All that remained was a strong woman who had learned to rebuild her own life from the shards he had left behind. After a few moments of awkward silence, it was she who broke the ice. "You say you want to win me back," she said, her voice steady as if announcing a challenge. "Then prove it. Give up everything, the money, the company, the power. If you really want me to believe you've changed, start over from scratch, without your family's shadow, without anything you've always considered essential." Her words hit him like a blow. Emily had given him an ultimatum he had never thought he'd hear. She was demanding the one proof of love he knew was almost impossible to fulfill. But in that moment, James understood that if there was a chance to win her back, he would have to go to the limit and show that his love for her was greater than any fortune or status. So, with a serenity he had never felt before, he nodded. "If that's what you need to believe in me, I'll do it," he said, meeting her gaze with a sincerity that needed no more words. The following days were filled with sacrifice and change. James began the process of severing ties with the family business. He resigned from his position, sold his shares, and cut all ties with the Whitford businesses. His decision was met with shock and disbelief by his family. Margaret, his mother, reacted with incredulity and indignation. "James, you're destroying everything your father worked for," she exclaimed, her voice filled with reproach and sorrow. But he remained firm, explaining that, for the first time in his life, he needed to make a decision for himself, something he had chosen with his heart. The luxurious mansion was sold along with all the assets he had maintained as part of the Whitford legacy. James kept only the essentials and prepared to leave the city he had known his entire life. As he left New York, he felt like he was leaving a part of himself behind, but at the same time the feeling of freedom was almost purifying. For the first time, he felt he was no longer living under the shadow of others' expectations. James moved to the same coastal town where he had last found Emily. He rented a modest apartment with a view of the sea and started working in a small convenience store. The simplicity of his new life was a stark contrast to the world he had come from, but he felt at peace. The days were long and exhausting, but he enjoyed the humble routine and the anonymity. The weight of the past seemed to finally be lifting, making room for something he had never known, the true feeling of humility and purpose. During those months, he didn't reach out to Emily. He knew she needed time to observe and believe in the change he was trying to achieve. From afar, she heard about his new life, the sacrifices he was making, the renunciations he had chosen to show that his love was sincere. Gradually, curiosity took hold of Emily. At first, she doubted, thinking he couldn't maintain the simple lifestyle, that he would return to the comfort of his former life. But the weeks turned into months, and he remained there, far from all luxury, committed to the promise he had made. Finally, on a cloudy afternoon, Emily decided to seek him out. James was working at the store arranging the shelves when he saw her walk in. His heart raced, and he could barely believe she was really there after all this time. Emily watched him in silence, analyzing every detail. He looked different, thinner, his face marked by hard work, but his eyes held a tranquility she had never seen before. There was no more arrogance or pride. All that was left was a man who had given up everything in the name of the love he felt for her. She approached slowly with a serious expression. "You really did it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. He nodded, looking at her with a shy smile. "I did it because you're all I truly have," he replied, without needing more words. Emily felt something inside her break, a barrier she had held up for so long to protect herself from pain. For the first time, she saw sincerity in his eyes, the same sincerity she had always wished to see. In the days that followed, they began to meet again, slowly and cautiously. Emily observed James, seeing how he adapted to his new life, free from status and wealth. She realized he had truly changed, that the man before her was someone who knew the pain of loss, someone who had learned to value simplicity and authenticity. The coldness in her heart was gradually replaced by a new kind of affection, and she realized she still loved him. One autumn morning, as they walked together along the beach, Emily finally forgave him. She looked at him, held his hand, and with tears in her eyes said, "I forgive you, James." Those words were all he needed to hear. Without saying anything, he embraced her, feeling the peace he had been searching for. From that day on, they started over together, without haste, without the shadows of the past. It was a new chance, a new life built from scratch. And beside her, James finally found what he had been searching for, a life with purpose, a true love, and a peace no amount of money could buy. So would you forgive James? After all that suffering and such a turn of events, would you give James another chance after everything he did to win back Emily's love? Tell us in the comments. If you were captivated by this story, full of emotion and drama, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to follow more romances and twists that will keep you hooked from beginning to end. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of our exciting stories. See you in the next video.